momento que todos esperávamos. Vamos para a talk do MPJ. Mattias, como eu gosto de chamar. Ou Mozão. Então, pois é. Todo mundo conhece o canal dele do YouTube? Function? Quem conhece? Show. Porra. Show de bola. This is all the amount of people that know you. Which is quite a lot. Então, beleza. Então, acho que não preciso introduzir na forma mais tradicional. Então, eu vou introduzir na forma que só eu sei, com os detalhinhos. Ele odeia ganso, por algum motivo, e gaivota também. É muito engraçado. A gente vai na praia, ele fica assim. Ele adora abacate. Mas o quê? O pai dele tem vários... como é que chama? Bode. O pai dele tem vários bodes na casa dele. E ele vem de uma família de artistas. Para quem não sabe, o background dele é de teatro e tal, não é de dev. E o pai dele pinta vários quadros, é muito foda. E hoje ele vai falar aqui pra gente de como é que a gente sobrevive à complexidade no código, o famoso código macarrão, aquele legado que ninguém quer encostar em mão. Como é que a gente sobrevive e até melhora essa code base. Então, bem-vindo ao palco, MPJ.
There's too many men, too many people making too many problems, and there's no natural around. Can't you see you got the land of confusion? This is the world we live in, and these are the hand when given. You stand the last start trying to make the place we love, yeah.
Ooh. See here. There we go. Can I get rid of this? Wow. I know technology. Boa tarde de sexta. So, let me give you an overview of this last talk of the day. I know that you are all mushy in the brain after a whole day of talk, so lucky for you, this talk contains no code. In fact, this talk sort of has negative code. It's about getting rid of and preventing code from existing, really. And one of my favorite quotes is this one. I hate code, and I want as little of it as possible in our product. By Jack Diedrich. And I don't actually hate code, and I don't think that Jack does either. In fact, I love coding, but well, how we write code, it's even more important to think about what code we write in the first place. So, in that context, what is this talk about then? I will try to convince you that no matter how good your team is at managing complexity, by structuring your code, for example, adding functionality always adds some complexity, at least a little, and I'm going to make the case that we therefore need to I'm going to make the case that we therefore have this finite amount of functionality and sort of like health points that we can add to our software during its lifetime. So I'm going to give 4 concrete examples that we can use to manage this influx of functionality. The first one is removing functionality, and I will talk about how removing functionality unfortunately doesn't really work, because it's much easier and more appreciated to add functionality. Yeah, I'm big on cheery subjects, aren't I? I will talk about how death by complexity is almost natural, and how bloated software eventually gets replaced by younger software that learns from the older bloated software. But I will also talk about how you don't have to let your competitors do that, how you can do that yourself. I will talk about minimalism, where you can decide to have software that is very, very focused on doing few things well and adding functionality very slowly. But minimalist software needs to be built on top of contracts. And what I mean by contracts is something like Unix pipes or the camera roll of operating systems. And finally, I will talk about shelves, which is a technique that Netflix and Snapchat uses by designing their software like shelves in a fridge with soft drinks. And that's all. If they... Yay! I love Brazil so much. If that sounds like stuff you already have in your noggin, you can go check Instagram or something, because that is like the entirety of the talk. But if you don't know me, for the people that didn't, I am known as MPJ on the internet. My current job is running 2 YouTube channels about programming called Fun for Function, and another one called Dev Tips. And together, they now have over 500,000 subscribers, which actually is more than the population of Florianopolis. So before being a YouTuber, I've been a full-time developer for 15 years-ish. And the last place I worked was at Spotify. You see here a picture from one of the furry Fridays at Spotify. The thing is, like, they have fancy Fridays, but for the British people that are employed and actually have suits, so they actually have a day to wear the suits. But in Gothenburg, where the Gothenburg office where I worked at the moment, at that time, nobody owned suits, so instead we purchased onesies for everyone and wore those on Fridays. So, what is bloat? I mean, we all casually know what bloat is, but let's actually think about it a bit and really try to properly define it. Photoshop. I had to break up with Photoshop a few years ago. It was a very emotional breakup because I had learned to use Photoshop when I was 13 years old. It was over 20 years ago. The first time I was ever sent to the principal's office was because of Photoshop. We had photoshopped our class photos, making everyone ugly and weird, and put them up all over the school. Very naughty. And I also spent a large amount of time on tutorials on how to make fire text. Green fire, of course. So cool. That we could put up on our Quake Clan website that had rotating 3D skulls. Oh, yes. So it really takes me, oh, that's so nice period. Very nice period. What was amazing was that we, as 13-year-old kids, we could learn and use Photoshop, and we could run it on our computers at the time, which had around 200 megahertz of processing power. And for the younger people in the audience who have never heard of megahertz, it's like gigahertz, but it's shit. So back to this picture, because it is awesome. As a 13-year-old back then, I possessed no attention span, and as we already said, like no processing power. But I could still learn and use Photoshop, because Photoshop was simple. It didn't have a lot of functionality for me to learn, and there wasn't a lot of code for the computer to process. But you know how relationships sometimes are. You start getting comfortable, you start letting yourself go, having too many cheeseburgers. And that is what happened with Photoshop. Nowadays, Photoshop is this insane monster. Today it takes ages to open it, even on this current MacBook, which has almost, and this is true, almost 100 times the processing power of the computer that I had in my teens. I honestly don't remember how long it took to start Photoshop in my teens. I really wish I did. But given the insane amount of power that this computer has, it feels strange to me that it is not instant. So let's have a look at Photoshop here. This is Photoshop 3.0. Back when I was opening Photoshop, when I was a teenager, it was just a lot less intimidating than it is today. The designers of Photoshop has done an admirable job at making this look sane, but whenever you click one thing here, it opens up in this cascade of complexity. There's just vastly more surface area to learn in Photoshop today. If you ever looked for the ultimate example of the term feature creep, you can look no further, because you can edit video in Photoshop. I feel like this is a pattern that I see a lot in the life cycle of the software. You start using some software, it's great, it's new, it's fast, it's reliable, and it's also a popular software because of all those reasons. So there are many other customers beside you using this software. So development is well funded. There are lots of developers hired to work on and improve the software, and life is great. But as the years go by, this experience starts eroding, starts becoming worse. The most common thing is that it becomes slower. But it just tends to also become harder to use, and it tends to become buggier. And software then has become bloated. Software bloat is something that most people have experienced, even non-developers. But what I would like to talk about today are some observations that I've made in my position as a software engineer about why I think bloat happens and why it's so incredibly prevalent, and also why it's so hard to prevent. And I'm going to muse a little bit on the 4 different approaches that I've seen being used to combat bloat. But before we do that, I would like to talk about, well, like, where does bloat actually come from? And the thought experiment that I'm going to go with today is that bloat fundamentally originates from adding functionality. There are arguably many reasons why a piece of software becomes bloated. Perhaps we've built stuff using libraries that are way too heavy. Perhaps we don't have good habits of refactoring. Perhaps we don't have... But for this talk, I would like to focus on simply the act of adding functionality. And the reason that I want that focus is because no matter how we keep our tech debt down by refactoring, no matter how disciplined we are to pick small libraries, the fact remains as you add more functionality, the bloat of your software will inevitably grow, at least by a little bit, with every new piece of functionality that you add. I'm going to show you a diagram, as the slide shows. It's a diagram that visualizes the logic that determines if Slack sends a notification or not. Are you ready? Like let's just take this in for a bit. So again, this is not like where it sends a notification or anything. This is just whether or not it sends a notification. So when Slack launched, and this is years old, by the way, so it's probably a lot more complicated today. When Slack launched, this logic was a lot simpler. But users requested ways to adapt their experience. In Slack, they added a setting here and there. Ta-da, we get this. So I'm a software engineer, so it's my job to manage complexity. And we have lots of techniques to manage complexity. Unit testing is one that comes to mind when I see this Slack diagram. For example, testing, refactoring, and optimizing, they are all very important to keep software from bloating. But I'd like to put them all aside today, because they don't really do much good unless we as developers learn how to manage the influx of functionality. And the reason for this is that managing complexity is a skill in the same category as juggling. And what I mean by that is that almost all people can easily learn how to juggle 3 balls. But many people, and there are some people that know how to do 5. But the world record for juggling is actually 11 balls. Humanity has not figured out how to do 12. And we have certainly not figured out how to do 20. There isn't like an upper cap. And I think that managing complexity is the same thing. We cannot rely solely on becoming better at managing more and more complexity. We also need to manage the inflow of complexity, or it's going to overwhelm us, no matter how good we are at the complexity management. So I'd like to talk about 4 approaches to manage this influx of functionality. And again, they are removing functionality, death, minimalism, and shelves. One approach that I have unsuccessfully tried many times is removing functionality. And what I'm referring to here is gradually removing functionality from your software that isn't seeing much use. Or that no longer makes sense in the cohesion of the product. However, I have learned the hard way that once functionality gets into your software, you just can't get it out. Or more specifically, you can, but it's so painful that it just isn't worth it. Yeah. When I worked at Spotify, I held a strong belief that in order for a software not to bloat, you needed to have a habit of removing features that no longer make sense or that wasn't getting a lot of use. And I did practice what I preached during my time there. I was the Grim Reaper of code. I successfully pushed this in the organization, and I actually ended up with a net negative of lines in GitHub during my time there, and I'm very proud of that. That said, that period taught me that functionality in software will always grow much, much faster than you can remove functionality. It's almost like a law of nature, sort of. And it's hard to remove functionality, too, because functionality is almost always very interweaved with the system. It takes a lot of planning and work to get it out in a safe way. It's also incredibly thankless work because even if the functionality you're removing is only used by a tiny part of your user base, those people are going to be very upset and they will give you hell for it. And they are completely justified to do so, honestly, because you are effectively having things that they rely on for their workflow just disappear from their interface, and that is dreadful. On the other hand, the 99% of users that didn't use your feature, they won't notice anything. So they won't thank you either. Sure, the app did become more easier to maintain, it became lighter, and the bug count is going to go down a little bit, speed is going to go up, but it's so subtle that nobody will really thank you for that. So people generally get promoted for launching features, not removing them. And honestly, as bitter as I am over that, it's for good reason. I've learned the hard way that if you add functionality to your system, to your app, it's going to stay in. So on to death. The most natural way of dealing with bloat is death. It's actually what will happen on its own with popular software that becomes too bloated. It eventually just stagnates, and then it gets replaced with newer and younger software. And that is what's happening right now with Photoshop, where it's quickly being replaced as a design tool by Sketch. And Sketch has learned from everything that Photoshop is good at, and they have implemented it all really, really well. The Photoshop team aren't less capable than the Sketch team at implementing functionality, but there's only so much that Photoshop can do, because the team is simply so weighed down by all this functionality that they need to maintain. Sketch, on the other hand, can look at what functionality isn't used so much in Photoshop, or that doesn't make sense holistically in a design software, such as a video editor, and just get rid of that. Because Sketch has this advantage of a clean slate to work with. However, you don't need to sit around and wait for a competitor to create this product. Many companies are proactive and create it themselves. They build a new product that doesn't replace the old one outright, but lives in parallel, and they try to gradually win customers over from the parent to the child. The most compelling example of this that I've found is Trello. Trello was created by Fog Creek Software, which was at the time mostly known for its bug tracker, FogBugs. The people working there, having worked with managing software development for years, had developed some very good ideas about how a software project tracker could be built. But they had the good sensibility to not try to cram those ideas into FogBugs or even make a rewrite of FogBugs. They made something completely different, which was Trello. There was no ambition of feature parity between Trello and FogBugs. They are almost completely different categories of product. However, Trello got massively successful, way more than FogBugs ever was, but no FogBugs customer was ever hurt in the process. Instead of death, there's another approach to managing the influx of complexity, which is minimalism. Some software combat bloat by not putting much functionality in there in the first place. They simply don't add more functionality, or almost none. And this is interesting because if you buy my reasoning that functionality almost always adds at least some bloat, and that functionality is extremely hard to remove, then that means that we have a finite amount of functionality that you can ever add in a given piece of software. So Dropbox, it's a very simple and straightforward use case, a folder that can sync, very little bloat, considering that it's 10 years old. I'd like to make a note here, and one reason why Dropbox has managed to not add a ton of features is that it's a subscription service. Dropbox can survive just fine by keeping the software fast and bug-free. Compare this to Photoshop, which historically had a business model of selling new versions of the software. They were basically forced to add new functionality in order to sell new versions of the software to survive. Then we have Grep. Grep takes some text and allows you to find and extract text in it, and that's all it does. In a myriad of different ways, but still, it's fine just the way it is. Grep is over 40 years old, but even so, nobody has tried to build a video editor into Grep. It's just good. Like, it's good the way it is. But Grep is a developer tool. So do we have any examples of end-user software that has a minimalism approach? We don't see much extreme minimalism in end-user software, but there are a few examples. And I use a piece of software on my computer called Break Time, which locks my screen every 20 minutes, forcing me to take a small break. Break Time is minimalist as hell. But generally, I feel that kind of software is not quite representative of how we build software for end users. In reality, minimalist software is more often like Grep. It's useful as hell, but not on its own. It's only useful when you combine them together. Grep would not be popular if it wasn't for the fact that Unix system has pipes, which allows you to chain Grep together in all kinds of other Unix commands. Mobile photo apps on your phone is an example in the end-user realms. I've had tons of apps on my phone that all do small aspects of video editing, such as making a collage, looping a video, adding text to an image, and stuff like that. And this behavior is pretty specific to photo apps, and my theory is that it is because they share an infrastructure that is similar to what Unix tooling has. Unix tools have all output simple data, mostly strings, that can be sent to other Unix tools with a standard interface called pipes. And similarly, photo apps on your phone all interact with one simple data format, the JPEG, through this standard interface, which is the camera roll of Android or iOS. So in order for minimalist software to become more popular, we need better contracts like the camera roll or Unix pipes. And in the future, if some sort of cryptocurrency actually gets mainstream use at some point, I believe that we will see a lot of minimalist software operating on top of it. Finally, we have the shelves approach. When I say shelves, I mean software that is modeled kind of like a soft drink fridge. There are different softwares in there, all adhering to a certain format, that is, being soft drinks. And the store removes or adds new ones based on what is selling well, or different campaigns. And my two favorite examples of this are Netflix and Snapchat. The Netflix interface is built out of these different shelves that show different types of content. They all adhere to the same generic contract, a list of video content, but the stuff in these shelves will go away if it isn't being used, and new stuff will take its place. Same thing with Snapchat filters, or Instagram stories, as they're now called. Snapchat offers a multitude of filters that you can use when messaging. But just because one filter happens to be there one week doesn't mean that it's there the next. They're limited edition. It's kind of like the pumpkin spice latte. It's there 1 month and it's gone the next. And the users understand this. They know that's this. And I talked earlier about how adding functionality always leads to more bloat, but I'd like to elaborate on that a bit, because not all functionality is born equal. Some functionality bloats the system a little bit, and some do it a lot, and some hardly at all. And one thing that determines that is how much they intertwine with the rest of the system. Rich Hickey, the creator of the programming language Clojure, has this fantastic talk about the word simplicity and its origins as a word. So complex, looking at the original Latin definition, means braided together. And it is the opposite of the word simple or simplex, which means side by side. So shelves has this important trait in that they are sandbox. Users understand and accept the things on the shelves, that they are isolated from each other, which allows them to come and go. And adding a Snapchat filter or a new Netflix recommendation list is sandboxed from other functionality, both technically and user experience-wise. Contrast this from, say, the playlist functionality in Spotify, which is completely interweaved into the system in different kinds of ways. Not only does almost all other features in the system interact with the playlist system, but we also have dedicated buttons in the interface that the user eventually learns to use habitually. So it's almost like a motor skill. So we effectively build functionality like that into the user's brain. Removing a Netflix list that doesn't perform well, that's pretty natural for the user, it just goes. But removing something like the playlist system, it's completely unfathomable because it's so weaved into both the code and into the user's workflow. All right, so let's recap what we thought about here. I talked about how Photoshop got bloated. I talked about how adding functionality always adds bloat, at least a little bit. So there's a finite amount of functionality that we can add during the lifetime of our software. And I talked about 4 different examples of approaches to manage this influx of functionality. I talked about how removing functionality doesn't work because it's much easier and more appreciated to add functionality. I talked about how death by bloat is almost natural, and that bloated software eventually gets replaced by younger software that learns from the older bloated software. But I also talked about how you don't have to let your competitors do that. You can also do it yourself, like Trello. And then I talked about minimalism, where you can decide to have software that is very, very focused on doing a few things well and adding functionality very slowly. But that can often require you to build on top of a contract, like Unix pipes or the camera roll. And finally, I talked about shelves, which is what Netflix and Snapchat uses by designing their software like a fridge with soft drinks. And that's the talk. And we are just on time, I think. But I would like, if it's okay with you, I would like to add a little bit here that I don't usually do and talk for just a little minute about Brazil. Brazil is a country that is having a little bit of a tough time at this moment in history. And so I would like to take this opportunity to say some words about how I feel about Brazil. I'm from Sweden, but Brazil holds a very special place in my heart. And I don't know what she said, but the first reason is, of course, that Brazil is the home country of Isa. She's your host today, but to me, she is my soulmate, partner, and queen. So even though we both have a strong connection to BrazilJS, ironically we didn't meet here. But when Isa was speaking at NordicJS, and I was hosting that conference in Stockholm, and we both fell in love that week, and we have been together since. And I'm infinitely grateful to Brazil for producing her. So in the last few years, I've come to really know Brazil and Brazilians more and more. And the more I do, the more I like you. There are some dark things happening in the world right now, and I would like to encourage you to stand up straight in the face of these challenges, because there are some things about this country that are truly unique and incredibly valuable. First of all, I really love that Brazilians are so warm and giving with your emotions. Sweden is a country where people are quite reserved, so for me, the contrast is incredible. Speaking at BrazilJS 3 years ago, that was so profound as an experience for me. It was my first really big public engagement, speaking engagement, and I've never felt so appreciated in my entire life. You were so incredibly supportive. People came forward telling me all these things about like what they've done in their life and how my videos have helped them. And everybody just goes and takes selfies all the time. It's like you truly feel like $1 million when you're here. And that is truly unique to Brazil and BrazilJS. This doesn't happen anywhere else. And you must know how distinct that is. If you were here back then in 2016, you really need to know that you really imposed on me that Fun Function, my YouTube channel, it's truly the most important work that I've done in my life so far, and you remind me to be more open with my own emotions towards others. And the second superpower that Brazilians have is your improvisational skills. Yeah. And you laugh about it, but it's actually very profound. The Brazilians that I've worked with during my time at Spotify were among the very best JavaScript developers in the company. And that means that they were among the best in the world. And I've come to understand, like recently, that there's something about your culture that makes you inherently good at software development, and that is your ability to improvise. So what makes Brazil different here is that it became really obvious to me when I visited Russia, because Russians, just like Brazil, there's a lot of people that don't know English. But Russians are more like, when you don't know Russian, they just speak Russian louder and more slowly as a response. And the Brazilians respond very differently. It's like when I was in Rio for the first time, there was this, I was getting a prepaid card for my phone, and the guy just waves me over to the computer, and then we chat through Google Translate. And this distinction shows you the cultural difference between Brazilians and other countries. And you will also see the same thing if you compare to, say, Japan. And I really, really love the creed in the beginning of this conference where the video says, you control the code, you control the world. And I think that you people here control something very, very important. Like the market of the software developer gives us the ability to choose what companies we work for and what tasks we perform within those companies. We have much more power over our lives and over the countries that we live in and the world that we direct than most other job groups. And I would just like to impose on you the big responsibility that you have in these sometimes dark ages that we live in right now, and try to do the best of that power. And with that, I just say, muito obrigado.